How to read waves surfing. Hey, this is Jordy from the Independent Surfer, and today we're going to be discussing or talking about how to read waves while surfing. So let's get straight into it. The biggest reason you can't read waves, or the biggest misconception with waves, is that it's really chaotic when you go out into the ocean. Like, there's a wave breaking over here, or there's a wave breaking over there, and there's not really much of consistency towards or in relation to how the waves are breaking. But honestly, like, this is the biggest mistake that I see most people make, is thinking about waves one after the other. But we're going to talk about how you can actually read waves really easily and how you need to think about it from a bigger picture rather than just thinking about it and being in like a reactionary state. Because what a lot of people end up doing is they'll sit out in the lineup, and as they see a wave, they'll paddle towards it, and then they'll go sit where that wave was, and then another wave will break over there, and then they'll see that wave and paddle to that wave. But doing that can pretty quickly leave you in a position feeling like you're lost out in the lineup. So let's chat about how you can fix that and how you can read waves while surfing a little better. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you to you, the sponsor of this video. Because of you watching this video, it means that we can make more videos to help you get better at surfing. So I really appreciate it. The last thing I want to say is, if you want to really improve your surfing, then join us at one of our surf retreats, or check out our online coaching where we can help you with so many things. You don't just need a video of yourself surfing, but like, if I'd say like the biggest problem that people have that we work with is honestly like their pop-up. They're like intermediates, they're trying to get better, and they just can't seem to progress. And most of the time it's because they're struggling with popping up. And if you just send us a video of you popping up in your living room, we can help you identify any sort of mistakes that you're making and just correct it so that, you can have a much easier time in the water. Cool. So the first thing that I want to talk about is consistency. Now, in order for us to chat about consistency, though, you kind of need to understand how waves are created and how they break, because understanding that will help you identify the consistencies out in the lineup and also know why there is consistency with the way waves break. The long story short is that waves out in the ocean are created by wind, and this wind that creates waves doesn't necessarily happen all at once. It blows over time. And over time, it will start really slowly and then increase in intensity and then kind of decrease in intensity after that. Once these waves are created in their specific area, remember, keep in mind that intensity. Remember, the wind doesn't just blow and then waves come and then that's done. The wind blows like slowly, increases intensity, decreases intensity. Remember this because it's going to be important. As those waves move out and away from where the wind is creating those waves, they move towards the beach, obviously, in a specific direction. Now, depending on that direction will depend on how the wave that you're going to surf breaks, but more on that later. As these waves move away from where the wind is creating them towards the beach, what happens is they start to space themselves out. And I want you to imagine, and the best way I can describe this is like a marathon. When you see a group of runners running a marathon, what happens is they all kind of start jumbled together. And then as we get towards the end of the race, this is where the waves break, the fastest runners usually have the furthest distance away from each other. So like as the number one runner, number two runners come in, you'll have a big gap between them. And then as the rest of the pack comes, as you get closer to the main pack, those waves are kind of all jumbled together. Or those people are all jumbled together. And that's the same as waves. When an arriving swell comes towards us, we have a very long period between those waves. And it's not always very long, but in most cases, it can be quite long. As those waves come in towards the beach and the group gets closer and closer, those waves get closer and closer. But what happens in this circumstances is those waves group together. So when you have a long period, you can expect there to be one or two waves in the set, up to even 10, and there will be long breaks between each set. And when you have a short period, you'll have a lot of waves in each set, like really close together, and there won't be long breaks in between the set. And now this is important to understand because when you go down to the beach and you try and identify what waves are breaking and where they're breaking, you need to identify consistency, because that will help you identify a point to sit out in the ocean to wait for waves. Because contrary to popular belief, when you go out into the ocean, a wave will pretty much break in the same place over and over again, depending on certain variables. Obviously, the wave could move slightly, a couple feet this way or a couple meters this way, depending on, whatever measurement system you use. But just know that within a 10-foot or like a 2 or 3 meter radius, maybe a little bit bigger, maybe 10 to 20-foot radius, if you just like have a relative position in that area and you keep going back to that same position, if you're patient enough, you almost always will be able to catch another wave. Because when we think about catching waves, we need to think about it over a period of 20 to 30 minutes versus over a period of 1 to 2 minutes. So when you're trying to identify consistency out in the lineup, you should be thinking about waves and consistency over a long period of time, rather than thinking about them over 1 or 2 minutes and then being reactionary or reactioned. Well, I don't know what the right word there is, but you get what I'm saying. Like, you don't want to be in a situation where you're reacting to a wave, paddling to it, getting out of position, and then reacting to another one, and then reacting to another one, and reacting to another one. You want to have a game plan of identifying consistency, keeping your position in a specific area, and then going off of that position, but constantly going back to that position as long as it's the right position to catch waves. Cool, so we've identified that waves come in groups, and oftentimes waves will break consistently in the same place. It's really important for you to identify this consistency before you paddle out, and as you paddle out and kind of find the right place, you want to make a marker in a specific area that you're going to line yourself up with. Now, depending on the type of break you go to, you'll have to be a little bit more active in terms of your position. So let's just quick example, there's 3 main types of breaks that we're going to consider for the sake of this video. Maybe there's many more, but there's beach breaks, reef breaks, and point breaks. Now, you might ask what the difference is. So a beach break is a break where you basically have a sandy bottom. And this is particular because where you have to be a lot more active at beach breaks in terms of positioning yourself in the lineup than you do if you go and surf, say, a reef break or a point break. And that's mostly just because of the underlying structure, which is sand at a beach break and can be sand at a point break. But because the current moves in a specific direction and it shapes the sand very nicely, what will happen is, like, within one session, you don't necessarily have to move around that much. Versus at a beach break, what you'll have is you'll have rip currents, kind of an area of water that goes back out to sea after a wave is broken. Waves are a displacement of water and they break in towards the beach. And as they displace water into towards the beach, the water has to go back out to sea somewhere. And that's what a rip current is, essentially. But what that can do is it creates deep spots, right? The water kind of takes the path of least resistance back out to sea. And that's the deepest spot between the sand bank, essentially. But the rip current is mobile. So, like, you go to a beach break and while in 20 minutes you sit in a specific area and there's good waves there, 20 minutes later, what can happen is that rip current can be coming straight out where you are, and you have to move left and right of that rip current and reassess and readjust your position. So that's beach breaks. You have to be slightly more active. You can't just rely on setting a marker and then, being reliant on that marker all the time. You might have to adjust your position over a 20 to 30 minute period because of that rip current. What's interesting though is that you can actually use that rip current as a reference point. So when waves break and they break left to right, what will happen is as that wave breaks in towards the rip current, it'll actually hold up on the side that the rip current is. When it comes to point breaks and reef breaks, this is obviously going to be a little bit different. Let's discuss reef breaks first. So they can be super consistent, like from session to session, you can pretty much almost always have the same marker to go out there and sit and be like, okay, if I line myself up with this marker and I'm this far out and I keep my position right there, then I'm almost always going to be in the right place to catch a wave. With the exception of like the tide moving and swell direction, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So basically, like, reef breaks are obviously the easiest to read waves because they're so defined. Like, as you sit out in the lineup, you're going to be maintaining your position, and it's really easy to know that, like, okay, every single time you paddle back to that specific point, you're going to be in the right place. And if you haven't got it already, like, the most important thing when it comes to reading waves is your position in the lineup. Like, we'll go over how to read waves in a little bit, but I want to stress that most people think when it comes to catching waves that you need to be able to paddle hard, but essentially all that it is like you could catch a wave without even paddling if you were in the perfect spot to catch it. So it's much more about how you position yourself relative to the wave, and that'll pretty much help you catch waves every single time. So it's a big part of reading waves. But back to reef breaks, consistency, putting yourself in the right spot, and then just trying to maintain that position. And this can change depending on tide and swell direction, but does not change as much as beach breaks. Going to point breaks, and the biggest difference between a point break and, say, a reef break is, like, a point break can have a sandy or a rocky bottom. It doesn't really matter, but it's just identified as a wave that breaks from one specific point and then moves in one specific direction, or kind of wraps around a point or a headland. It's like quite obvious, and you can generally ride that wave for a relatively long period of time without ever really having the possibility of going in the opposite direction. Versus a reef break would probably give you the opportunity to go in a different direction. So a good example, like a good kind of like example of this is like a J-Bay would be considered like a reef break. And then, like, when you think about a wave that kind of breaks similarly to J-Bay, like if we talk about something like cloud break, like when you think about cloud break, it for some reason, and correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but it's almost kind of considered a reef break, even though you can only surf it in one direction, so it can be a little bit confusing. But I guess it's just the way the wave is structured. Like at cloud break, you can have many different takeoff points, and sometimes it can be hard to connect them. Versus J-Bay, a lot of the time, you can kind of connect the wave more consistently. I don't know, I could be wrong. But the biggest difference would be like a wave like J-Bay, which is a point break, versus a wave like Pipeline. And I'm just throwing these names out because they're the most famous, but a wave like Pipeline, you know, you can go left or right, and it's a rocky bottom. And then J-Bay, you can go right, and it's a rocky bottom, but you would consider it a point break. And then going back to a sand bottom point break like Snapper Rocks, you know, you wouldn't call it a beach break, it's called a point break. So there's just like some terminology there. But what I'm getting at here is point breaks are also easy and consistent. They pretty much break from one direction and move down the point in one direction. So you don't have to worry about whether or not it's going to be a left or going to be a right. And that's kind of the same with reef breaks too. You know, identifying consistency, if a reef break consistently breaks to the right, then you're going to consistently go right. So you just kind of have that idea in your mind to help eliminate doubt when it comes to like reading and identifying waves, and which waves are good to go for and which direction you're going to kind of go on that wave. So those are the different types of breaks. Beach breaks you have to work really hard at in terms of maintaining your position and kind of, you know, reassessing all the time. Point breaks, you'll have to do a lot of, what would you call it, lateral movement to make sure that you're getting in the right position as a wave comes towards you. Just know that doesn't matter which of these breaks that you go and surf at, your relative position in the lineup, wherever you go and think is the right point, is never going to be perfectly in the right point. And as a wave comes towards you, you're still going to have to adjust your position slightly as the wave comes in towards you. Cool, so now we understand the importance of positioning. I want to talk a little bit about not only finding your position, but maintaining your position out in the lineup. So again, we'll get into how to read waves in a second, but when you go out into the lineup, there are going to be many factors that are trying to move you out of position to catch a wave. One of those factors being current. So again, waves are a displacement of water. As those waves are moving into the beach, you're also going to potentially get pushed into the beach because that's water moving into the beach. So it could be moving you in towards the beach. As that wave breaks or that set breaks, there's going to be water moving back out to sea, and that's going to move you out of position. And here's a quick tip, actually, like the most important time to maintain your position out in the lineup, or at least be aware of where your position is when you least expect it, directly after the set has broken. So after that last wave in the set, you're going to have all this water rushing back out to sea somewhere, and that's going to create current in the lineup and really try and move you out of position. So this is where you need to be most vigilant. Something else that will move you out of position is the wind. So if the wind is blowing particularly hard in any sort of direction, you can almost anticipate that you are going to move with the wind, and you need to try and maintain your position according to that. Tide doesn't, I wouldn't say like tide necessarily moves you out of position, but what it will do is change where the wave is breaking. So if the wave, like if we're having incoming tide, you can almost always expect the wave shape to change, and then also like where maybe what will happen is the wave will start breaking closer to the beach, and vice versa. If you have an outgoing tide, wave shape can change. You'll have that, like, maybe the wave starts to break further out relative, and maybe in a different spot on the reef or on the beach break, like maybe a bit more to the right or a bit to the left. And these variables are constantly changing, so you just need to identify that those things can, one, move you out of position, but two, change the way the wave breaks. For example, when you have quite a bit of onshore wind, what that will do is while you're sitting where the waves are breaking, that wind will actually blow you in towards the beach. But what it can also do is it can amplify the rip currents, because you have extra water being pushed into the beach. That water needs to go back out. So what you'll notice is, like, when the wind is onshore, the rip current or the water moving in the channel will actually be relatively stronger than if you had like no wind or potentially offshore wind blowing. That's the gist in terms of positioning. It's so important that you maintain a good position out in the lineup and that you're constantly adjusting. I would say trying to identify your marker every 45 seconds to a minute, just to make sure that you're in the right place. And don't get complacent. I see a lot of people sitting up on their board and getting too comfortable while sitting up and not actively moving. And by the time they see a set coming, they are completely out of position, because during the lull, like during the break in the set, they've been waiting for a wave thinking they're in the right place. So it doesn't matter how well you can read waves. If you're not maintaining your position up in the lineup, you're never going to be able to catch them. So let's jump into what to look for and how to read waves. Now, the first thing you want to try and identify is obviously you're going to be looking out to sea, and the sooner you can identify a set of waves coming in, the better off you're going to be. So some surf spots will have specific markers, like maybe an outer reef where the wave stands up first and then you can anticipate a wave coming. Maybe a set of rocks that you'll see the surge kind of move up against, and then as that surge moves up, you have a couple seconds to respond to a wave coming in towards you. But for the most part, if you start to look out to sea and you notice a shade change, and when I say out to sea, I mean quite far out, like you're trying to pay attention almost to the horizon. You're not just trying to look out like and see, like, I don't know, 100 feet, 200 feet, or like, maybe like 50 meters ahead of you. You're trying to look at the horizon and you're trying to identify shade changes. Now, at the slightest possible shade change, eventually, over time you're going to get better at this, but in the beginning you might struggle. But at the slightest possible shade change, you need to start anticipating the fact that there might be a set coming in towards where you're going to be trying to catch the wave. And in this moment, it's really important that you actually start adjusting your position as to where you think that wave is going to be according to the shade change. Now, again, in the beginning, you're going to be like, oh, well, that shade looked the same as that shade. But over time, you'll get better at identifying maybe or anticipating, the size that wave is going to come in and the angle that the wave is going to come in relative to how you saw it far out at sea. By the time you've noticed this, you maybe have like 20 to 30 seconds to make sure you kind of adjust, maybe line back up with your marker, and then you need to sit and wait. Next, as that wave approaches you, your goal is to try and identify the trajectory of that wave to make a decision as to whether or not you need to paddle out, paddle in, paddle to the left, or paddle to the right as that wave is coming in towards you. because if you just sit where you are 9 times out of 10, that position is going to be wrong. So even if you're like Kelly Slater, or like, I don't know, you're like the guru of surfing, the god of surfing, and you've been surfing forever, you're still going to have to slightly adjust your position to maintain and make sure you're in the right position relative to the wave's trajectory. So again, don't worry if you get this wrong in the beginning, but over time you'll get better at making these like predictions as to where you think the wave is going to break relative to its trajectory. Cool, so you've identified, now you start to move around. The next thing you're trying to find is the high point versus the low point. The highest part of the wave technically is the part of the wave that's going to break first. And the lowest part of the wave is technically the part of the wave that's going to break last. So as a wave peaks up, it's going to peak up like this, and then you're going to have kind of this like, line where one point is high and one point is low. This part will break first, and then it will run, and then that part will break. And your goal as a surfer is to try and optimize or maximize the most out of that wave. And so you want to move towards the highest point so that you can take off at the peak and ride it down out towards the shoulder. So now you've identified the high point, you're paddling towards the high point. The next thing you need to start identifying is the shade change in the wave. Depending on the surf spot you go to, each surf spot will hold a certain set of characteristics. As an example, like if you go to a wave and the wave breaks really softly, then you can almost always expect that wave to break kind of softly, because that's the nature of that surf spot. Versus if you go to a surf spot that breaks, and has a really steep dumpy wave, then that's the nature of that surf spot. And so when it comes to reading waves, like obviously you need to get used to each specific surf spot, because identifying these characteristics and knowing exactly when this wave is going to break is going to be different from place to place. Here's an example. So if you go surf a wave, like we're just going to use famous names again, Waikiki, then, because what happens now is like after you identify that wave, that color change, what you want to see, and just hold this for a second, but what you want to see is you want to see that shade go from a light shade to a dark shade. And as the wave gets closer to breaking, it'll darken in shade. And what you'll notice is the top part of the wave will become increasingly more defined as it's getting closer to breaking, and then eventually that top part will start to shimmer. I call it feathering. It'll start to feather a little bit, and then the wave will break. However, like at some places, this is going to be more noticeable than others. And at some places, the area where this is like the length of area of where this is happening is going to be shorter versus longer. So as an example, going back to Waikiki and Pipeline, if you go to Waikiki and you see the wave kind of getting really dark and start to feather, you could probably still assume that you can catch this wave at this point. But if you go surf a wave like Pipeline and you see it really dark and starting to feather, then it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to expect that you'll be able to catch it, because once that feathering starts happening at Pipeline, that lip is going to plunge forward and break really intensely. Versus at Waikiki, when it kind of feathers and breaks, the wave kind of maybe will only break at the top half of the wave, and the whole wave won't fall over itself, giving you a lot more space and time to be able to catch that wave. So again, taking those sets of characteristics that happen at each different wave and applying what I'm mentioning here to that wave, because every wave is going to be slightly different. But that's the gist of it. You want to pay attention to the top line, where the high point is versus the low point. You want to pay attention to the shade as that wave gets closer and closer to breaking. It's going to get darker and darker in shade. And then you want to also pay attention to that feathering action. Like, is that like, as you see the green part of the wave turn into white water, that's when you're going to know, okay, at a place like Pipe, you're going to be too late and you need to paddle out. Versus at a place maybe like Waikiki, you might still be in the right place and you might still be able to catch that wave. So it depends on those sets of characteristics. But that's it. Now you can read waves.